Don't worry, it may be Black History Month in the States, but this isn't another video of a white girl telling you about the state of race relations in the country. No, I'm here to crash the line of defense that, well, why should I pay for slavery's misdeeds? My ancestors didn't own slaves.
According to a newly discovered exchange, award-winning actor and film director Ben Affleck insisted the producers of PBS documentary series Finding Your Roots hide the fact that one of his ancestors was a slave owner.
Aware that your great-great-grandfathers were slave owners in Alabama before the Civil War, and has that revelation caused you to change your position on reparations?
You know, I find myself once again in the same position as President Obama. We both oppose reparations, and we both are the descendants of slaveholders.
So, raise your hand if you are 100% sure that your ancestors didn't directly profit off of human slaves. Oh, not so fast, New England. Not that New England is particularly guilty either. I'm just going to use it as a case study. If you get to claim the Bill of Rights as your constitutional liberty, you also have to take the baggage that comes with it. But I'm going to use New England as a highlight example here. Much of today's video comes from data compiled by the Atlantic Black Box Project, a repository cataloging the age of slave piracy in New England. Link is in the caboose of this video. So if you grew up in a northern state learning about the first half of the 19th century, you know the general line of things. The United States signed federal legislation in 1794 banning the international slave trade, which would go into effect in 1808. The U.S. then made trading slaves in open waters a crime of piracy in 1820. Crucially, of course, it didn't ban domestic slave trade, thus fast-tracking the somewhat unique institution of chattel slavery. The first person to be executed for slave piracy was in 1862. There is an attitude in the North that, oh, those dumb hicks in the South, of course they're racist, but my ancestors are so good. Well, looking to my own home state of Maine, schools there would teach us all about Joshua Chamberlain and the battle for Little Round Top, arguably a moment where a Maine man literally saved the Union. Chamberlain himself is something of the state's own miniature George Washington, and it was pressed home to us that we, the state of Maine, had more casualties in the Civil War than any other Union state, as a share of the population. In fact, Maine's wartime governor, Israel Washburn, exceeded the federal draft requests for 3 years straight. The state's zeal would teach them the harsh lesson that Europe didn't learn until about 1916, that when you draft your male youth by community, you might see the entire generation wiped out. Maine's abolitionist history is also very proud. When the issue of Maine's statehood and independence from Massachusetts became tied to that of Missouri, also looking for statehood at the time, several Maine representatives in Congress, who were Massachusetts representatives at the time, voted against the Missouri Compromise because it would lead to the expansion of slavery. And due to soldiers' correspondence, we know that Maine had a large number of soldiers in 1861 who saw the war as the righteous cause to end slavery. If you want to find a state that had the heart of the Republican Party in the 1860s, and you chose Maine, you'd probably be happy with your choice. Now comes the part where I betray you. You probably also learned about the Anaconda Plan, Lincoln's aim to blockade the South with the Union Navy and squeeze them economically until they surrendered. You might have also learned that the Anaconda Plan was an almost immediate and resounding success. Sure, there were blockade runners, but it was so effective it would be studied for the next 50 years of how to wage domestic naval warfare. But You might ask, if the South was so invested in trading with the British and French, how come they were crushed so easily? Surely, even if they needed an emergency merchant marine draft, they should have been able to keep some small lifeline open. And that brings us to the dark underbelly of American slavery that New Englanders, in particular, like to bury under the rug. Because all of those traders, both dealing in trade goods like cotton and maintaining the human slave trade, were from the North. Because it wasn't only the Americans who had made illegal the international slave trade, the British had as well. And we know from the British records that, for example, an American ship called the Rufus Sole was captured by the British Royal Navy. The British found them guilty of transporting slaves. The prisoners were set free, the crew marooned at the nearest factory, that is, a naval trading post, and the British then burned the ship. Rufus Sole, by the way, is the name of a famous shipbuilder in New England, and a study of his known registry also provides many instances where ships traveling from New England would make stops in Baltimore and transport slaves further south, and would further trade with Africa and Brazil for human beings. In modern money, he made millions of dollars off slave trading alone. Remember, 1858. Maine may have had a proud abolitionist movement, but its biggest industry, its shipbuilding industry, depended on the money transferred with the sale of human beings. But there's plenty of blame to go around. Let's talk about something called the Mary Carver affair. The Mary Carver, captained by Eben Farwell, was attacked by natives of a small hamlet called Little Barrowby in 1842. The crew was massacred. The massacre was so swift and brutal that the crewmen below decks didn't even know that they were under attack. Of note, the reports that we get from missionaries of the attack state that there were many women involved in the massacre. In response, the United States sent the USS Saratoga under the command of Commodore Perry to punish the natives. This is the Wikipedia entry for Little Barrowby. The Americans wiped it off the map. You might have noticed I didn't talk about what Farwell was trading. Curiously, official records leave that part out. The only report is that 600 pounds of camwood were not ready for transit. But the Mary Carver was a schooner, which had an average tonnage of about 125 tons. Here's where archaeology and common sense come in, though full disclosure, the following information is somewhat contested. We do have diaries of crew members of the Saratoga, which confirm that the Mary Carver was operating out of a factory, one she had set up to deal with the African natives on a permanent basis. But the factory, or the loss of the factor, its operator, was not mentioned in the motion for a punitive expedition. So according to the official historical record, Farwell was a tradesman who traded in trade goods. But for the natives in Little Barrowby to take the Mary Carver so completely by surprise, again, so thoroughly that the captain didn't know he was being attacked until they burst into his cabin, they would have needed to have overwhelming numbers. And again, all we know the Mary Carver was planning to take was 600 pounds of wood. That's roughly 1/3 of 1% of her cargo capacity. That seems like a waste to have built a trading outpost, staffed it with a permanent factor on salary, to come away with such a small catch. So what might Farwell have been trading, where a large number of native men and women roaming his decks would not have been suspicious? And just because you lived in a free territory, it doesn't mean you didn't own slaves. Allow me to introduce you to America's first baronet, Sir William Pepperell, a Massachusetts man who owned a plantation in Antigua. He had around 20 slaves at any given time. Of course, given that his property in Antigua is a sugar plantation with an average life expectancy of 7 months, we can assume over the course of his life, he worked dozens, if not hundreds, of human beings to their deaths. Less than 30 years after his death, Massachusetts proudly claimed that there were 0 slaves in Massachusetts in the U.S. Census of 1790. But there were still a number of aristocrats who owned slaves. The reason they needed these plantations in the Caribbean was because rum was the major manufactured export in New England in the late 18th century. Directly importing the sugar at low cost was vital to keeping that industry afloat. And all of these industries intertwine. Connecticut made its money off of the insurance industry, hoping that these massholes would be successful in their voyages and keep delivering those fat stacks. Massachusetts would later pass laws that, yeah, you were a free black man, but you couldn't live in the state for more than 6 months at a time. This video is not about white guilt. This is a video about white responsibility. As I said before, you want to take pride in the Declaration of Independence, in the Emancipation Proclamation, in ending the Nazi threat in Europe, in putting the first man on the moon? That's fine. That's your right as an American. But you have to be an American. A real American. Someone who accepts, and isn't afraid to know, the good and the bad. To dismiss these details as white guilt while you chant USA, USA is like showing up for the Super Bowl kegger decked out in your body paint, but you don't even know who the teams are this year. Which is why I want to end today's video on a hopeful note, with one final story from this time period. The Porpoise was a brig that traveled the world out of Maine. She stopped in Brazil before setting off for Africa. Only when they were halfway across the ocean, too far to turn back and mutiny, did the captain tell his crew that they would be hauling slaves between Africa and the Caribbean. The Porpoise worked in conjunction with the cargo ship, the Kentucky, which hauled 500 slaves back to Brazil. Brigs were attendant ships who used their boats to help load cargo onto the main vessel. The small crew of the Porpoise despised this. There was a mutiny aboard the Kentucky en route, and almost 50 rebellious slaves were killed and mutilated as an example to the others. But back in Rio de Janeiro, one of those disgruntled crew members turned their captain in. More damning was that while mid-trip, the Kentucky had painted over her name as to evade authorities, a very severe crime of piracy. And I want to go out on that note. That one sailor who turned in the entire expedition, he didn't have a say in what he was doing with regards to the slave trade. He had to eat and get his pay. He had to obey the orders of slave traders. I don't think that any reasonable person would call that man evil just because he was living the rat race. It's what he did with that knowledge when the power to effect change came to him that determined the quality of his character. And we should all emulate him when we discuss how we, white America, deal with the legacy of slavery. We didn't ask for it. We didn't know it when we signed up. We, by necessity, have had to be complicit. But now with distance, hindsight, and honesty, we have the power to effect change and undo the wrongs that were done.